Thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome to the Smart Contract Security Roundtable series hosted by Forta. If you're not familiar with Forta, we are a decentralized network that monitors blockchains in real time for threat and anomalies, and our mission is to secure Web3. Today, Forta is being used by some of the largest DeFi projects, for example, to monitor the security and health of their systems. The topic for today's discussion is Web2 versus Web3 security. This is a topic that has come up in previous roundtables. I know the last one we did, we talked about bridge security, and we highlighted the Ronin hack, which is interesting because it had a lot of Web2 sort of components to that exploit. So really timely, and we've got some great guests on to help us unpack this. So we have Christian Seifert, who's a researcher in residence at Forta, recently joined us from Microsoft. We have Peter Kacherginsky, principal blockchain threat intelligence researcher at Coinbase, and also the author of the blockthreat newsletter. We have Matt Suiche, CTO at cybersecurity firm Kome, and we have Tal Berry, co-founder and CTO of crypto wallet ZenGo. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Hello.
So we're gonna have I'm really excited to have such a diverse group of guests here with us. But the neat thing is that everyone has some experience in Web2. So you straddle the fence between Web2 and Web3. So for everyone listening, I always like to try and set a backdrop for these conversations, so that you have some sort of mental model or framework, to organize the discussion with. So for this one, I guess my opening comments are going to be that, I think the Web3 community likes to draw a line in the sand and talk about Web2 as sort of the old paradigm. And Web3 is new, they're doing things different. And while Web3 offers new engagement models, new business models, new ownership models, the reality is that we don't turn off Web2 and turn on Web3, right? There's a gradual transition, and during that transition, there's a lot of overlap and touch points between the two, and there will probably always be touch points between these two worlds, because a lot of our decentralized networks and decentralized applications actually have a lot of sort of traditional Web2 components to them. So I want to start by sort of double clicking on this overlap between the two, what we refer to as touch points or points of overlap between Web2 and Web3. And Christian, I'm gonna start with you, but Peter, Matt, Tal, I'll let you jump in as well. Christian, when you think about the relationship between Web2 and Web3, centrally managed applications versus decentralized applications and networks, like where are a lot of those common touch points that you see?
Well, I mean, I think in Web3 currently, as you mentioned, is really not operating in isolation. And the way I look at it is kind of from a user's perspective and a protocol's perspective. So from a user perspective, users are still managing their wallets, so private keys on endpoints. So endpoint security becomes important there. Really love what ZenGo does in that space with the secure multi-party computation on their wallet. And then users, of course, they browse the web, right? They use their browser, get to websites, and that really makes them susceptible to social engineering attacks on their Web3 assets. And then on the protocol side, we have, of course, the traditional infrastructure that is utilized to support these decentralized applications. And then also we have to think about the developers that are developing these decentralized applications. They're using systems. So I think there is a lot of kind of infrastructure-related security that is relevant there. And I'm always talking about a comprehensive layer approach to security. So I think if somebody wants to secure Web3, they also need to think about the Web2 kind of components of their overall applications. And I think the Badger DAO attack, as well as the Ronin attack, are a great example. On the Badger DAO attack, their web front end was compromised, and on the Ronin attack, essentially their validator nodes were compromised.
Yeah, to add on that, I would say that besides of the specifics of Web2 and Web3, I think there are many concepts like security is security, and whether you're securing, defending internet or industrial control systems or Internet of Things or Web3. So I think that as with many other things in Web3, we have the tendency to, reinvent things, and in part, this is the essence of Web3. But some things do not require reinventing. We don't need to reinvent economics or reinvent, in political science and in governance, and also in security. Because so there are many concepts in which we can draw inspiration, let's say, from Web2 and apply it, not copy it, but smartly copy it and use that in our Web3 world. For example, if we have security monitoring in Web2, we will need to find what is the equivalence of it in Web3, and not reinvent things from the ground up. Draw inspiration from Web2.
Well, I was going to add, we actually went through this cycle already. Like when back in the early 90s, we were so focused on the traditional infrastructure attacks, and we learned our key security paradigms like least privilege, how to approach, securing instead of your keys, securing your machines. And then the web showed up, and no one knew what to do. And then everyone's getting hacked in the 2000s. And we figured it out. We adapted what we learned from infrastructure security to web security. And now the cycle just repeats once more, where we just take all the best lessons from decades of security knowledge, and we're just applying it to a new domain.
Yeah, no, I agree. But even within the blockchain ecosystem, we start to see like some of the things that were like being reinvented, being more or less like abandoned. Like if you look at Ethereum, the Ethereum virtual machine, like first they came up with their own instruction set, etc. So they had to redesign their own virtual machine from scratch. And now you see like a new generation of blockchain. So if you look at Solana, they would use like BPF, so they would not have to reinvent their own virtual machine. Same thing with Near, they would use like WebAssembly, and instead of having to reinvent their own like language, like Ethereum did with Solidity, and I guess Christian, you can probably also tell us more about that too. Like if you have to audit like smart contracts on Ethereum, so good thing there's like some framework like Open Zeppelin, etc. But they had to redesign like an entire new programming language, which is Solidity. Was like now we can see like particularly like projects like Solana and Near, you can compile from Rust to like either like BPF or WebAssembly. So even from that, in terms of like tooling for application security, you can see like there is a whole like layer of tools that can be reused. I would be interested also in hearing more about your thoughts on that later, Christian. But yeah, in terms of like Tal was saying, basically security. There's so many components between like application security, like web security, and I think that's kind of the interesting part about like Web3 security is like you have so many verticals, and a lot of people are not even aware of like the different verticals. But yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
So for those folks who just joined, the first question was about the overlap or touch points between Web 2 and Web 3, and what we heard was that most decentralized applications, or probably all decentralized applications, have sort of Web 2 components to them, right? Whether you're talking about front ends that users interact with, connect their MetaMask wallet to, the private key management aspect, to custodying, securing your own assets, and then on the protocol side, you have a lot of traditional infrastructure that support these dApps, and a lot of developers use existing tools, to support the development and maintenance process. And so, when you look at vulnerabilities, it's not just at the smart contract level. It's at you see hacks that take advantage of these sort of traditional components. And so my takeaway here was that there's a lot of institutional knowledge that's been developed over the last few decades when it comes to web security, right? And so we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to apply things that apply existing best practices and frameworks and processes, to this novel innovation, and understand sort of where it pushes boundaries and where it's unique, and then maybe tweak and adjust. But we don't need to necessarily start from scratch when we think about security. So I think this is a good segue. Christian, you mentioned two recent exploits, Badger DAO and Ronin. So I want to talk about sort of Web3 native attacks versus Web 2 native attacks. So when I say Web3, I'm talking about things that are protocol enabled by a DeFi protocol, for example, like a flash loan or Oracle manipulation, things like that, versus a Web 2 attack, which is more which we saw with Badger DAO and Ronin, right, where a front end was compromised, or validator node keys were compromised. I guess my question for the group here, and feel free to jump in. No particular speaking order here. I'm interested in your perspective. Like, when you think about Web3 security, like, is any one of these things sort of a bigger concern for you than others? Like, do you think more about our Web3 attacks sort of, is the industry currently, are they more capable of dealing with those, or because those are sort of newer, we have less of a track record to sort of work from, versus Web 2 attacks where there are best practices here, right? It's just on the teams and communities to sort of implement those.
Well, I want to say that the attacks are different, though. So between when you're attacking anything on the Web3 space, all the transactions are recorded. It's done completely in the public. Everyone can observe it. There are greater chances to detect it. Attacks on the Web2 side, oftentimes you're dealing with opaque systems where is everything logged that needs to be logged? Probably not. Where in Web3, you have a permanent record of everything the attacker did, where they try to launder the funds. And then in terms of response, it's the attacks are different as well. How do we respond to Web3 attacks? Our contracts, a lot of contracts don't even support pausing, or it's difficult to upgrade them, where on the Web2 side, you just pull the plug and your website is halted. So you can stop the losses quickly, and you can patch and modify things on your dApp pretty quickly. So there are different paradigms in how the attacks are, even how attackers are approaching Web3 versus Web2 exploitation.
Just to add on Peter's saying, so to add another dimension, I think that usually teams within the Web3 domain, they're probably well versed in Web3 issues such as you said, Oracle manipulation and so on, so forth, but not necessarily, very much knowledgeable about what we call Web2 security issues. So this is another element because that really requires a bigger team with diversity of knowledge in all other security domains, which are not necessarily their day-to-day job, which is around Web3 and smart contracts and so on.
Well, it could be that they're also doing some threat modeling, right? If your Web2 interface is compromised, the primary impact is on the users going to those websites, getting their wallets emptied. If your contract is compromised, you usually, more often than not, it results in total loss for the project itself. So maybe the focus on looking after smart contracts is because just you have to pick your battles. Again, these are small teams we're dealing with. So you want to watch the majority where your treasury sits.
Yeah, I would say even like post incidents, like there are some incidents. Sometimes we don't know exactly what happened. Like in the case of Ronin, for instance, like if I remember correctly, they said like some private keys were compromised, but we still don't know how they have been compromised. I see like Sam Cizis in the group. Maybe you can tell us more about it later. But yeah, like there's always a lot of work that's done by like the Twitter community every time there is an incident in terms of like sharing knowledge on attacks, which is like always good. I think it's a good also to learn. But in a lot of cases, and maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see many like official detailed response from a lot of the projects. In terms of like sharing the experience and like how they handled like the incident, what they did after, etc. A lot of the time, it's mostly about like reassuring their users, but very rarely about kind of like them having like a proper deep dive or like how some of the entry point for the attack was. I'm particularly thinking of like the Ronin one for like the keys.
I agree with you that on the Ronin attack, kind of the post-mortem still left a lot of questions open. But generally, I would say Web3 is much more transparent than in the Web2 world in terms of analyzing what happened and taking actions in a public forum on how to make protocols more secure. If you think of Web2 world, there was an attack just a few weeks ago where large companies were compromised by a teenager. You didn't hear anything in terms of kind of how that happened. But on Web3, like repeatedly, you see very detailed postmortems. Again, Ronin, I think, was a little bit of the exception where a lot of questions were left open.
Yeah, but at the same time, Ronin is the biggest one. That's why, that's the most representative one from the industry. And Web2, companies not being open. I mean, I guess it depends because there's way more companies, so I guess it's very hard to compare. We don't have exact data. But for instance, the GitHub security issue that happened a few days ago, also impacting Travis and Heroku, they've been pretty transparent around the incident. And I think Tal can also correct me if I'm wrong. But in a lot of countries, I'm thinking particularly in Europe, I think it's the same in the US. I'm not sure. If you're a victim of a security incident, you're it's mandatory for you to notify users. So in terms of that, it's not like you can really put it under the rug and just walk away without informing your users. I guess more about the post-mortem where okay, this is what happened, this is what users should do, which usually I think we'd still see in Web2. But the whole I mean, I agree, there are things being more transparent in Web3, but I don't know if they're really way more transparent than Web2. I guess in one now the aspect is whenever there is money being stolen, okay, you can track the funds.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a big advantage in Web3, right? Like you can really quantify the losses, which I think down the road will really help us into making better risk assessments, as well as kind of give the rise for, cybersecurity insurance. That then is really where the premiums are kind of derived from the risk profile of the protocol, as well as how many assets they hold, et cetera. I think that's very different than in the Web2 world, where it's just much more hand-wavy and nebulous in terms of what the losses are.
Hey, Christian, I want to follow up on that real quick. And Peter, you touched on this too. So for those joining, we're talking about the difference between Web3 attacks and Web2 attacks, and sort of the different characteristics of them. And some of the things that were said were that Web3 attacks are public and on-chain, whereas Web2 attacks are more opaque, and not as transparent, unless those details are shared publicly after. So I guess my question here is, do we learn faster because of are we able to learn faster and sort of as an industry sort of react faster and implement better processes and programs for Web3 attacks because everything is public and everyone sees it, and so everyone's learning sort of at the same time, at the same pace?
I wanted to add just a bit of optimism to where we are today. Like we're seeing DeFi exploitation really existed for 2 years, and it's noisy, and we're hearing all these bad news, like hundreds of millions of dollars are lost. But the same attacks were happening in the Web2 space for 2 decades, and they continue happening again and again. And the reason why is that unless you are an incident responder at Mandiant, you don't really know what happened on the inside. You don't know what was the initial vector. What did they do? How did they get into the systems? So we can learn a lot faster because it's so exposed. In 2 years, we already have well understood classes of attacks, from flash loans, from the arbitrage attacks, and so on and so on. So we will learn a lot faster on the Web3 side. And Web3 security, I think, will surpass Web2 security just because we're all sitting in, it's all in front of our screens that we can learn continuously. Where in Web2, it's still they have no incentive to release those detailed postmortems that all of these projects are releasing, saying exactly transaction after transaction, payload after payload, how did the attack happen, how you can prevent it in the future.
Yeah, plus to one to that, and if you think about kind of like how a company secures their network, right? They have a SOC, and that's a finite amount of people. Whereas here, it's really open, and the entire community has eyes on it. And what that does, it also brings in, a diversity of ideas around defending a network, which I'm super excited about in the Web3 space.
I mean, I agree on some points. But if you just compare like Web2, like security, if you're just talking about like web applications, you have organizations like OWASP where they documented like non-type of like web vulnerabilities, what to do against them, etc. Like I'm sure we're gonna see like something similar for like Web3 security, where like you said, like a lot of the vulnerability classes will be documented, like the flash loans, etc. But those are things that are like present for like Web2 security, because like Web2 security has been an issue for like 20 years, so I don't know. I would say if it can surpass like Web2 security, because I still think they're like so intertwined, like they depend of each other, like you cannot have Web3 without Web2, because it still relies on a lot of like cloud security, cloud infrastructure, like web applications, like the full stack, like the tech stack for like Web3 stuff is not like only like Web3, like you still have other like variables around it, components that are not necessarily like Web3. So I would not necessarily say it would surpass like Web2 security. And I would say the contrary. I think there's a lot of like good things that were done for like Web2 security and application security in general, network security that Web3 can learn from in terms of like documentation and all those things.
Yeah, and although I share Peter's opinion about the potential Web3, and in fact we have a faster, we're closing the loop much faster and identifying classes of attacks much faster. We do have to acknowledge that in Web3 we're dealing with currently with cash money. So all like even if we know all the details, etc., but we all only know that post-mortem, so we can learn for next time. But currently we are lacking the ability to react in real time in most cases. So I think the really important thing here is to make detection and mitigation faster than exploitation, and this is it needs to come from two different directions. First of all, trying to add more friction to transaction, making transaction finite in longer terms, like we can imagine on kind of a solution, putting it, whatever you do in the protocol, putting it, let's say, in a vault that will only be released after, let's say, 20 blocks, which would provide some time for the defenders to see if this transaction is actually kosher, and if not, they can do something about it. So on one hand, we must add some friction to DeFi. That's at least my opinion. And on the other hand, of course, work on immediate detection that will allow us to respond to this kind of attacks.
So Tal, I want to follow up because I think that's a really interesting. It's a really interesting conversation. Whether I guess the dynamic between sort of permissionless permissionless applications and contracts versus things that that introduce more friction or checks or slow things down. And the way I'll phrase this question is I think the sort of startup mindset, right, is try to reduce friction wherever possible, right? Because you're trying to optimize the user experience. And at the layer 1 and L2 level, right, we're trying to speed things up. We're not trying to slow things. We're not trying to slow things down. So I guess my question to the group is like, is it realistic to expect that teams are going to introduce friction into the user experience or slow things down because it makes them more secure, or they can react faster? Or do we need to accept the fact that there's going to be less and less friction dealing with these applications and networks? Things are going to get faster and faster, and we just have to find, we have to think about it a different way, or approach it a different way from a security standpoint.
Well, the question is like, there's some features that are built into DeFi today, which should we consider advising against them? Like flash loans. Flash loans are amazing to enable a lot of the money legals within DeFi, but introducing friction into that would, I think, destroy a lot of the business prop for what these projects are trying to achieve in the name of security. I'm not sure if people will buy that.
No, but I wonder, like, if you have a DeFi protocol with a lot of funds in them, does every transaction need to happen instantly? can you scale it where maybe some high risk transactions, like let's say, assume like the entire amount of tokens in a particular DeFi protocols can be transferred instantly? Could we introduce some friction for those and leave the normal cases, as speedy as they can be?
We already have that in governance. So look at the governance protocols, they have all sorts of delays and checks and things that are introduced to add that friction. So maybe we could follow that path.
Specifically for flash loans that you raised, like I think even in Forta, I think there is currently all kind of alerts against flash loans. So I would say that although might be an important tool, again, I think it's a trade-off in here, and maybe some would say I don't want to have flash loans interacting with my platform. Would even view it not as a bug, but as a feature. I would say not only for direct security, but also for all kinds of arbitrage manipulations and so on. So I think in the end of the day, this is a trade-off. And I know like adding friction is a bit radical, but this is exactly what is saving the banking system today, because looking into current banking system code base, they're probably much worse than Web3. But in the end of the day, they have added so much, there is so much built-in friction and bureaucracy and so on and so forth that even though it's not hard, I would say, to move money within the banking system for hackers, but in the end of the day, to actually cash out, it's very, very hard there because of all this friction and reversibility. So I'm not saying we need to go all the way there, but I would say that going forward, I believe we would have to introduce at least a slight amount of friction to the process, at least in some projects that we want to put security first, maybe on top of having completely frictionless experience.
All right, I want to go back to something that Peter, I think it was you. You mentioned the fact that DeFi teams, Web3 teams are almost always smaller, and they're smaller by sort of design. They're also smaller by sort of the nature of the fact that this space is only a couple years old, right? So everyone is still a startup. So I guess that's one data point. The second is that security is not a revenue generating function. It's a cost center. It's a decision that teams have to make to invest in, and it's ultimately a business decision, right? What's the risk versus reward of doing this? And so my question from this is, does the business decision sort of calculus change? Is it a different calculus in Web3 because you have smaller teams, but the risk profile or the impact that they're responsible for, right, is in a lot of cases really high, right? So should they be thinking about it differently? Should they be thinking about the business decision differently, or like does the security model need to change? For example, like instead of bringing things in house, right, and building out a 400-person security team, is it instead going to be, like Christian said, sort of more community driven, or more you're going to have or more security committee third party driven, right? Like we've seen with Compound and Opens Up, and would love to get your, I guess, everyone's sort of take on the how a small team should sort of think about like scaling, a security function, knowing that they're probably always going to stay small, but their risk profile is going to grow really fast.
Well, there is nothing wrong with having a lean security team in that sense, but I guess here is you're protecting digital assets. So like Tyler was saying here, like what you're trying to protect is not necessarily data. It's most of the time like digital currencies or like NFTs or etc. I guess that's one of the aspects where like the approach is probably going to be different. And I think one of the big driver, which was a big driver in traditional security, and I think is going to be one of the big driver also here, is going to be like regulation and compliance. As we're going to see crypto becoming more and more mainstream, regulators are going to start to push for more and more like compliance requirements. And I think it's going to be a big driver of like what projects are going to be doing in terms of like implementing like an actual security team, having like post-mortem like process in place for incident response, application security. So I think that's what we're gonna see, and I think that's gonna be like the biggest pressure, because if your community, like there's you can only intervene if it's open source or like if you do like a post-mortem analysis, but in terms of like some of the other things, that may be like pushed by regulators in terms of like having regular audits, etc. I mean, like like there's I don't want to mention the company, but I'm sure it's gonna be pretty clear to everyone. There's a company called Well-Known to do like audits in the blockchain space, but every time they publish a report, like they've been criticized a lot, although they're getting a lot of attention, So like from an external point of view, be like, oh, they've been auditing like so many projects. So the projects are being transparent. They've been auditing by those guys, but if you look in practice, it didn't prevent like a lot of issues to happen, and even a lot of people to be like very critical of the quality of the reports. But that said, like I was saying, those things, like are probably going to be pushed more and more for like compliance. I'm sure that's where we're going to see a lot of the change and kind of like a lot of people trying to do like new projects, being like, okay, that's how things should be done, because if you compare like a startup or like larger companies with like a lot of projects, where you would see like a CISO, like actual like point of contact for security, like I don't think we have seen many point of contact for security in a lot of like projects, without DeFi, etc. Most of the time it's the CTO or like the tech lead, but there's no like proper like fully dedicated like security teams, at least from what I've seen. Like maybe it's changing, etc. But I would love to hear your opinions also on that.
Well, Facebook was a tiny company as well, right? At one point, and they probably also did not have a security team. But I think a lot of DeFi projects, they'll grow, they'll become 1,000, 2,000 plus corporations in the future that can't afford their own security teams. Yearn has excellent in-house security team, as an example. They're growing that, but I guess one concern, since we're comparing Web 2 and Web 3, on the Web 2 side, whenever you start outsourcing security, you're oftentimes sharing a consultant who has a dozen other projects that he's scrolling through logs, scrolling through events, and he may not be as familiar with the specific nature of what makes your project secure and when is the actual incident is happening. But that's in the Web 2 world. In the Web 3 world, because everything is public, because you have people like Sam who will message you up whenever they see something is happening, I think in Web 3 we can actually start outsourcing a lot of the event monitoring to the community, because they're highly vested and interested in your project being secure, and they have tools, they have logs to see if there's something that is off.
Yeah, I also wonder whether security will move from a cost center to a differentiator. I mean, you could see that maybe wallet providers eventually will expose reputation scores around DeFi protocols, basically giving users an indication on kind of how risky, how secure they are. And then really security will turn to a differentiator. If a DEX has essentially the same feature set, but has a much better security offering or security, as a user, in combination with what wallets may do, will maybe drive more usage towards the more secure protocol.
Yeah, so I have to agree that there will be regulation. Either, like, I agree with Matt that most likely it will be external and imposed on such projects, but there will be also voluntarily like de facto standards of reputation that would, reward projects that and incentivize them to invest more in security. But I don't think it will be enough, and we'll see also down the road external regulation and compliance requirements for DeFi projects.
Christian, I think what you said was interesting. I have my thesis on that is that while the protocols will obviously remain decentralized, right? The front ends are likely to to be regulated, and more users will use those. It's more likely that users will use those regulated front ends, right? Because those teams are investing more in user experience and customer support and like you mentioned, insurance. So we may find ourselves in a world where the majority of interactions are happening through regulated front ends, but those front ends are integrated with the protocols on the back end, right? Passing liquidity down, for example. And so you can also sort of find differentiation at the integration level, right? If all the major exchanges are integrated with, the top two, lending protocols, that's probably because they're comfortable that those protocols are reasonably secure, and they have a comprehensive sort of security, plan, in place, that with real-time monitoring and incident response and and continuous audits and all that stuff, right? So I agree, like your average user is only exposed to the most reputable protocols because they're using regulated front ends, and those front ends are only integrated with the most reputable protocols. So that's my thesis, and we'll see if it plays out. I wanted to jump to wallets because I know this has come up in a couple of your comments. We put a lot of security responsibility on the end user today, and I'm trying to reconcile whether this is a function of the space being immature, and so it just sort of, the end user is sort of the de facto responsible party, right? Because the tech stack that we're all integrating or we're all using is immature, or whether there is this more permanent shift of responsibility to the end user because the nature of Web3 is that we get to own our data and own our assets. So Tal, I'm particularly curious about your perspective here because you run a wallet, but Christian, Matt, others would love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Okay, so I think it's a great question, and I think although we're passing much of the power and the responsibility to the user, we all know, like, as we used to say, be your own bank in the Bitcoin, and users don't want to be their own banker or CISO, like chief information security of the bank, and also economical advisor of the bank and so on and so forth, and they are usually also not equipped to it. So in many cases, the client software in all communication protocol, the client software is like the line of defense for the users. And I think that surely wallets can do much more in order to protect the user. I think like the two most pressing issues is right now is, of course, still protecting the user private key against all kind of attacks that has all kind of trade-offs between them, between theft, loss, social engineering, like support scam, like tell me what is your seed phrase so I can help you, and so on and so forth. And we have to remember we are a very young industry, and most of our users are immigrants to this world, and we need to protect them in this fragile state of being new and not go. The joke says you have to go through being scammed a couple of times, and then you're into Web3. So we're trying to save the users a few cycles of scams because many users will not return after the being scammed for once. And I think we can do so. As I said, like with our technology of multi-party computation, we offer another working point there, not fully owning your keys, and hence, as a result, also not being susceptible for all kind of seed phishing and so on and so forth, and losing the key and being stolen. And another very important aspect, which is more direct to aim to Web3 specifically, is making a transaction much more comprehensible to the end users. And instead, for example, I think one of the most important parts and less understood by new users is the matter of approval of ERC20s and NFTs. And besides, of course, showing them and telling them what to do. But if we could, instead of telling the users, look at the spender address, go to Etherscan, see how many transactions and how many this address has, figure out what is the reputation. If we can wrap it all up and just show it to the user, look, this is this address did not interact so much, or not too many users had approved to it, maybe you raise a red flag. And especially like if it's an EOA address, if it's a regular address, then really set a red flag. So this is all kind of things we can really help users in making a smarter decision. And we must do that if we want to onboard more and more new users into this exciting world.
Yeah, I also want to add something because you raised an interesting point, Andrew, because and very likely, like we're gonna see a divide between, like most of the users, like the general audience, they're probably gonna just lean towards like regulated platforms, like a Coinbase, etc. They're gonna kind of limit their risk profile in terms of what they're gonna use, and then all the early adopters, we're gonna start to use like actual wallet, in their browser, like the early adopters. I think that's more like the DeFi type of users, like Peter was saying before. I think it's an interesting point, like that you think a lot of the DeFi projects are going to go to like thousands of people. I mean, it's very possible. But there, like the profile of the user is going to have to be more advanced. And then you have like Tal was saying, all the scams. I mean, even undocumented behaviors, like a week ago, like someone on Twitter was complaining about MetaMask having like backups in iCloud, and then they got the iCloud compromised. So like, how do you even document that? So like, there's some part also like from the wallet, for like those undocumented behaviors. But the question I think is like, how many of the users are gonna be like pure like DeFi users? I mean, like I would love to hear your thoughts, guys, on that, because all the people who are like I'm talking to are like new like adopters and stuff. I still feel like it's still like fairly like complicated for a lot of people. There's a huge like barrier of entry. Whereas like you were saying, Andrew, if people are using like the top reputed services, like regulated with like proper teams behind, like that's probably going to be most of the actual like users, at least for like the next 5 years for sure. But that's my opinion. I would love to hear more about what you guys think on that, because I think we're gonna see a huge like split between like people who think they're like Web3, but in fact they're just gonna use like centralized like services, and people who are gonna be like pure DeFi and gonna go through some scams, and where we try to save them to be like scammed by other project, and some like other projects being hacked, because like small startups, because we saw it a lot with like fintech startups, they don't have a security team initially. They only start with like a proper security team once they get to a certain size. But yeah.
Well, Matt, I hope it's not going to happen that way. Like that users tend to gravitate towards custodial asset managers, right? You still want to have the ability to participate in Web3 with non-custodial management of your assets. But I think what we need to do there is really improve the usability and support those users, right? Like as Tal mentioned, like going on to yesterday, I bridged some assets from mainnet to Polygon. And I had to sign 2 transactions. Very cryptic hashes appeared. I had no idea what I'm signing. I think that really needs to address to support the user in these interactions, so they're able to assess, hey, what is the risk profile around those?
I guess same with Christian. I really hope we don't go into the future where people want to go centralized again just because they don't feel safe. To push forward what Tal mentioned, not only my dream or what I would like to see in a wallet, not only just the ability to say like, hey, this is a reputable project and here's the explanation of your entire transaction. I think it's too much for users. What they really need, I think, is some kind of reverse web application firewall that tells them, hey, you're submitting this transaction to an EOA address, and that's suspicious, or a bunch of users voted that this particular contract you're about to interact with and send money to has been reported as phishing. So you already have this information and tags on Etherscan, and there are a variety of projects like CryptoScamDB. There's a database embedded inside MetaMask, but that is all static. What's missing is a more dynamic approach of saying, you're about to do something really dangerous. Stop. Like you go to in Google Chrome, when you go to a website which is a suspicious phishing website, you get this big red screen saying like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" So I think if we offer this level of security to users, so there's parity between what they've come to expect in the Web2 world, that a lot of the phishing sites, they are blocked pretty quickly, or AV engines can pick up suspicious behavior, applications that are trying to encrypt your entire drive, and they give you this pop-up saying that I'm not going to let you do this. I think we will achieve this decentralized future in a much faster way than instead of pushing people back to centralized where they feel safer.
All right. Well, Peter, I think that's probably a good place to close. We're a minute past the top of the hour. I want to thank Christian, Peter, Matt, Tal for joining, and for all those who joined in to listen. Thank you. Again, this is part of the Forta Smart Contract Security Roundtable series. So something that we try and do every 2 weeks. So next one should be early May. So keep an eye out for that. And we will see you next time. Hope everyone has a great day, evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.